Good morning. It's nice to see all of you here. My name is Nancy Fuller, and I'm delighted to welcome you to U.S. Museums Learning, Teaching, and Expanding. This program is one in a series of reports sponsored by the Fellowships in Museum Practice Program. The Fellowship Program is an independent study opportunity for experienced museum professionals. It allows them to study a topic of their choice while in residence at the Smithsonian. And the program is generously funded by the Smithsonian's Women's Committee. Since its earliest history, the Smithsonian has shared its museology resources and knowledge with the museum profession, both nationally and internationally. Today we will hear from three distinguished colleagues who will talk about the relationship of the Smithsonian and the museum profession. We'll begin by introducing them, and then a question and answer period will follow after they give their remarks. The first speaker is Dr. Pamela Henson. Pam is Director of the Institutional History Division, Smithsonian Institution Archives. She is responsible for the history of the Smithsonian, including research, publications, exhibits, public programs, education programs, documentary editing, and an oral history program. Pam received her BA and MA in Museum Studies from the George Washington University and a PhD in History and the Philosophy of Science from the University of Maryland. Pam's research interests include the history of natural history, museums and the role of women in science, the use of visual materials in historical research, and oral history methodology. Most recently, she published A National Science and a National Museum, which is found in Museums and Other Institutions of Natural History, Past, Present, and Future. She also recently co-curated Smithsonian Expeditions, Exploring Latin America and the Caribbean, which is an exhibition at the Miami Museum of Science. Her presentation is titled Smithsonian Institution as Learner and Teacher. It will provide background on the Smithsonian's role as an institution of education as well as research. The second speaker is Dr. Douglas Evelyn. I always call him Doug. Last December, Doug completed a 36-year career at the Smithsonian. He retired from the position of Deputy Director of the National Museum of the American Indian, a job which he held since its establishment in 1991. Previously, Doug held similar positions at the National Museum of American History and the National Portrait Gallery. While Doug was at the Portrait Gallery, he began researching the history of the Patent Office. This effort led to the publication of the papers of its principal architect, Robert Mills, and to A Public Building for a New Democracy, the Patent Office Building in the 19th Century. That is the topic of his PhD thesis for George Washington University. Doug began his museum career as an administrative assistant at the American Association of Museums and continues to be a strong supporter of professional associations. He has served as an officer and board member of the American Association of Museums, the Cultural Alliance of Greater Washington, the American Association of State and Local History, and the United States Board of the International Council of Museums. He now is on the boards of the New York State Historical Association and the Historical Society of Washington, D.C. Today, Doug will talk about the Smithsonian and the emergence of the modern American museum profession from 1950 to 1975. And our third speaker is Mary Alexander. She is Director of the Museum Advancement Program at the Maryland Historical Trust. Mary has worked in the Washington area since 1970, primarily focusing on museum education. Her employers have been the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Museum Education Roundtable, the National Archives, Mount Vernon, and Hillwood Museum. From 1987 to 1991, Mary led the Common Agenda for History Museums, a national program that provided her with a very broad perspective on museum practices across the United States. In 1998, Mary co-authored Museums, A Place of Learning, a volume that marked the 25th anniversary of the American Association of Museums Education Committee. It places museum education within the context of historical trends in museums and current theories in pedagogy. Mary earned a master's degree in education from the University of Connecticut. She is currently at work on a revision of Museums in Motion, an introduction to the history and functions of museums. Mary's talk is titled 21st Century Museums, Old Forms, New Options. We will have questions and answers at the end of Mary's presentations. Thank you for your attention. Pam?
Good morning. I'm going to give you an overview today about the Smithsonian as a place of education. And of course, we'll begin, not surprisingly, with the will of James Smithson, the founding donor of the Smithsonian, who left his bequest to the people of the United States for the increase in diffusion of knowledge. And this is because he really believed in the power of research and that knowledge would improve human conditions. He really held that kind of idealism about knowledge. Interestingly, when the bequest was announced in the United States, everyone assumed that it was to build a national university with that language, increase and diffusion of knowledge. So all of the early discussions assumed this. And there were many, many proposals for various types of educational institutions, such as a mechanics institute, an academy for women, graduate school, scientific school, school of the classics. But ultimately, this idea is rejected and does not make it into our enabling act. The feeling is that in a democracy, we shouldn't really use money from a foreigner. We should provide for the education ourselves of the children of a democracy. So this interesting early idea, we could have easily have become the National University of the United States, did not happen. And many other ideas were put forward that included increase in diffusion of knowledge in their mandate, probably most notable among them, the creation of a national museum. And this was to preserve, organize, and display the nation's treasures in art, culture, history, and science. And this idea is really brought to the fore by Spencer Fullerton Baird, who was the first curator of the National Museum, the first director of the museum, and ultimately the second secretary of the Smithsonian. The first secretary was reluctant to have a large museum, but the second secretary really pushed this idea forward and really saw its educational potential in a democracy. And he brought in as his assistant a man named George Brown Goode, who was an ichthyologist, and he was the second director of the U.S. National Museum, and he's an extremely influential figure in our thinking about education in our early years. He was very influenced by his first work at the Smithsonian, preparing exhibits for expositions, and saw this as a venue for public education, public adult education. And he really then became the leading U.S. museum theorist of the 19th century. And he saw museums as not only research institutions, but fundamentally as educational institutions, and argued for this very greatly in the course of his career. He believed that there was tremendous potential for adult education that in museums, that museums could be agents for adult education in a democracy, that you could create object lessons from the specimens that you placed on display. You didn't just put out one bird after another, but you really created object lessons. You really cultivated powers of observation in your visitors. This is a really important idea for him. And you would thereby teach adults to analyze and to develop their own conclusions. And he really felt these critical faculties that you would develop were really important in a democracy. Also early on, both he and Baird engaged in professional training, and this group that we see here in this picture is the Megatherium Society, and these are young scientists who actually lived in the building we're in, the Smithsonian Castle, in the towers, and they really began through the hands-on training that's the hallmark of a lot of museum education, studying under Baird and Goode. And from the 1850s on, the Smithsonian really became an ongoing site for informal museum professional training. As I said, this is primarily a hands-on training, what we would now call internship type of work, but a very lively group here through the 1850s and 60s. But Good, interestingly enough, did not argue for classroom education, for dealing with the elementary and secondary level. He did not believe that museums could or should play a role. And we have to remember this is the era of rote learning of the 3 R's, where you have a focus of memorization, not on experience or analysis. And so he really, himself in his early writings, does not see this fitting in. He tells us, I should not organize the museum primarily for the use of people in their larval or school-going stage of existence. The public school teacher with the illustrated textbooks, diagrams, and other appliances has in these days a professional outfit which is usually quite sufficient to enable him to teach his pupils. So he really doesn't see this as a focus for what the Smithsonian should be doing. Other things that he says, though, resonate more with our thinking today. He says, in this busy, critical, and skeptical age, each man is seeking to know all things, and life is too short for many words. The eye is used more and more, the ear less and less, and in the use of the eye, descriptive writing is set aside for pictures, and pictures in their turn are replaced by actual objects. This is the lament of many of us with the Internet, but Good was saying this in the 19th century. And again, he says, the museum cultivates the powers of observation, and the casual visitor even makes discoveries for himself, and under the guidance of labels, forms his own impressions. In the library, one studies the impressions of others. So he really makes this distinction of the primary object experience. And he says an educational museum is one in which an attempt is made to teach the unprofessional visitor. It's an institution for popular educations by means of labeled collections, and it may be also by public lectures. So he saw lecturing in conjunction with the collections as a very important function. And he says, the library is most useful to the educated, the museum to the educated and uneducated alike, to the masses as well as the few. So he really saw this as a very broad forum for popular education. And he tells us, an efficient educational museum may be described as a collection of instructive labels, each illustrated by a well-selected specimen. And he cautions us that a finished museum is a dead museum, and a dead museum is a useless museum. So he is never satisfied with his displays, with his collections. He's constantly refining what he does. And he refers to a museum as a nursery of living thought. So he's really countering these ideas of museums as stodgy places, that he really wants the visitor to engage and think and develop critical skills. So what we see for the diffusion of knowledge, in the early years, they're very interested in adult education. They really are not focusing on school level, elementary and secondary school education at all, but they also are engaging in professional education. But then trends come from without the Smithsonian that really affect our interest in K through 12 education. And these are, in many cases, the new educational theories developed by Europeans such as Froebel, Pestalozzi, and Montessori in the late 19th century. And they really focus on experiential learning, learning from objects and having direct experiences of the world around you. And this really fits with Good's idea of the museum experience. And various places where you found this were the Oswego schools, the University of Chicago. They really pioneered a lot of these experiential learning techniques. And these begin to filter into the Smithsonian because these type of educators start coming to us. Our first real venture into this was something called the Children's Room in this building that opened in 1901. It was the project of the third secretary, Samuel Langley, and it was a special exhibit for children. The objects were placed at eye level. The labels were in language that children would understand, and living animals such as aquariums and birds in bird cages were there, as well as museum specimens to really engage the young learner. And this was our first really serious attempt to engage children while here. In the early 20th century, we really start responding to these new trends in education and doing things like setting out school sets. And these are excess shells, minerals, et cetera, various specimens that we have for teachers to use in the classroom. And this is really quite a popular undertaking through the 1950s. And we also began escorted tours of school children to the museum, or as we see here at the National Zoo, a wonderful group. And we also began to prepare for our exhibit halls handouts that teachers could use when they brought a group, or parents could use when they brought their children, to teach them a little bit more and perhaps learn more when they went home. And we also began to engage in non-classroom childhood education. The 20th century saw the rise of many informal groups for children, such as junior naturalist clubs, spurred by the nature study movement, the rise of the 4-H, scouting, and campfire movements. And back in those days, until post-World War II, staff actually worked 6 days a week. You worked a half a day on Saturday. And Saturday was the day that these groups would come in and visit the museum, go behind the scenes with the curators, or get a special tour, as this Boy Scout group is doing. And this was a very lively enterprise through much of the first half of the 20th century. And they would have some structured activities and learning from objects for these students. We also published more outreach things, such as the Smithsonian Scientific Series in the 1920s. These were a series of 12 top popular books on topics relating to the Smithsonian, such as astronomy, the zoo, anthropology. They were planned originally as a fundraiser, but actually lost money. But classroom teachers found these of great interest, and classroom teachers on their own initiative went out and created a study guide to this set of books. So they began to be used in the classroom, and this group of teachers actually prepared the study guide to go with it. We continued outreach with radio programs such as The World Is Yours, 1930s and early 40s. Very popular Sunday evening radio program produced by the Smithsonian with the U.S. Office of Education and NBC. And it appealed to both adults and children across the United States. And there would be a topic each week that was introduced by the old-timer, who would then ask questions of the curator, and you would learn about it. And very quickly, we began to send out curriculum materials to schools in advance of the broadcast. So teachers could prepare students, they could listen to the broadcast, and then discuss them the following week in class. But post-World War II saw a huge expansion in educational activities of all of these sorts at the Smithsonian. First, we began an exhibits modernization program. Docent programs began to be formalized. We began to do teacher workshops and more formal teacher guides, a lot of public programming with TV, radio, touring exhibits, et cetera. And we formalized our internship and fellowship programs, and we began programs to train museum professionals. Some of the most important influences in this were Secretary Leonard Carmichael, who was an educational psychologist, and he worked with primates. So this is actually his research area. He came from outside the Smithsonian and came in just as we were beginning the exhibits modernization program, and is really interested in applying educational psychology to these new exhibits. We were also, many of the staff, very influenced by Alma Whitland, the museum theorist, who really brought to people's attention the concepts of audience evaluation and focusing on educational techniques. She was very influential here. And then, following Leonard Carmichael, Secretary S. Dillon Ripley, who really pushed to create formal ties with higher education as well as the K through 12 classroom. And so we had things like the exhibits modernization, which really was sort of a radical departure from the exhibits that went before it, applying these new theories of educational psychology, using far fewer objects, much more text, contextual interpretive presentations, integrating objects and ideas into narratives, also interactive activities, and we began to attempt to evaluate how effective these exhibits were. And we began to include educators in exhibit planning, and I say that off the top. That was a long and difficult process to actually change the curatorial approach, but it began in this time period actually getting the educators at the table from the very beginning. And these new approaches then sort of flowed out of the Smithsonian and did influence a lot of other museums in the United States. It really was an innovative period here. And these are some examples of these exhibits modernization halls that look very, very radically different than the ones before. This is the Hall of Health on the left and the Bird Hall on the right. Few objects, text, has a concept that you're trying to get across. In the Hall of Health, this particular, the figure is an interactive one where you can press buttons and learn about various parts of the body. We also begin to formalize training for museum professionals with the Office of Museum Programs. In 1971, things like the Conservation Training Series, which is sent out and influences people across the country. We do museum techniques workshops, and we really have a very formalized internship and fellowship programs with hands-on training for professionals, and this becomes much more structured during these years. And what we see is the origin of the Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies, both in that Office of Museum Programs, but also the education side, the Smithsonian Museum Service, which began in 1958 to sort of help with school tours and programs. We formalized a division of education and training after Estill and Ripley became secretary in 1964. And various museums began to create their own education offices, so actually hire staff who were educators to create activities with the exhibits. Initially, they would kind of come in with an existing exhibit and see what they could do with it. But over time, this really begins to shift, and they begin to be integrated into the exhibit planning process. And a central Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, and a sort of umbrella organization, is created in the 80s, although the museums still continue to have, many of them, their own dedicated offices working. And then we now have Smithsonian Center for Education and Museum Studies today, providing a broad umbrella to all of these types of training. The education centers and museums did some very, very innovative things in these years. The Naturalist Center at Natural History, the Discovery Room, the Insect Zoo, and the Naturalist Center and Discovery Room allowed not just children but adults to come in as well. And the Discovery Room was a little more child-oriented. In American history, they took some of these ideas and adapted this into the Discovery Corner, which is as much for adults as it is for children, but provides a really hands-on experience with objects, really focusing on not just K through 12, but adult education. And the zoo, which was really one of the great innovators in this time period, created things like Bird Lab, Zoo Lab, where you're really having hands-on experiences with these, with actual objects. And as we can see in this example from African art, they start to develop these programs where you have limited access for a group of students, more structured and focused experiences so that they can actually directly interact with objects in the museums. And this is really, as we all know, it's become very professionalized and formalized now, but very effective in terms of really galvanizing interest. Public programming, we continue to do a great deal more. The Folklife Festival, which included educational activity tents, the Discovery Theater at the Smithsonian, and many other special programs, primarily often at openings of exhibits where we would have very active programs for people to come in and learn more about the topic. SCEMS then began much more formal work, teacher workshops in the 70s and 80s, and these were not just to teach the children who were coming in, but teach the teachers so that this could then go back to the classroom. And I started doing these quite a while back, but initially they were very much a top-down approach. We would come in as the curators and we would teach the teachers about our resources, and this provided ongoing educational credits and stimulated great interest in our resources. But often what these teachers learned was difficult for them to actually go back to the school and apply in their classroom, and that's one of the real lessons that we learned. So starting in the 90s and our approach much more now are teacher partner type of programs where we bring in teachers to advise Smithsonian staff on what they need. We pay attention to state standards of learning, school district curriculum mandates, and our goal is really to produce exercises, materials, et cetera, that can actually be used by the teachers in their classrooms. So this is really much more structured and focusing on primary source education as well as specific content areas. So both of those. And Teaching American History grants in recent years have really stimulated a great deal of this. And it's important because with the advent of the Internet, we can really make facsimiles of so many archival documents, objects, et cetera, available to the K through 12 classroom. And so it is really exciting. So to conclude my quick overview, the Smithsonian first focused on adult object-based education for citizens of a democracy. But the growing sophistication in educational theories outside the Smithsonian stimulated changes in our approach and our concepts of audience. And these were experiential learning, educational psychology, and audience evaluation. Educational theory and educators really became a crucial component of exhibit planning as well as evaluation. Formal education programs were created with school systems to respond to their needs, to teach the teachers. Our focus is on primary source education as well as specific content. We've maintained our commitment to adult education through exhibits, publications, public programs, televisions, radios, and now websites. And we have maintained and formalized our commitment to professional training in museum techniques as well. Thank you. Questions? Okay.
Good morning. I'm going to give a talk rather than read a paper, although I have a lot of paper here. And I'm going to focus on the 1960s. And this is somewhat autobiographical. I think the quickest way to do this is to try to put you back in that era. In the post-war, American museums in 1950 faced a challenging post-war environment. They were denied the full tax benefits of educational and charitable institutions while they faced growing demands for services. International and domestic events caused their leaders to advocate the museum's role in education and service to society and to seek support from governmental and non-governmental forces. Converging forces in the 60s involving leadership by the Smithsonian altered the public perception of museums and strengthened their capacity to meet society's demands through improved training and professional practices. The Smithsonian's engagement with professional issues affecting museums and collaboration with the American Association of Museums and others during the 60s to promote the benefits and needs of museums helped form the foundation for today's museum profession. And I'm going to talk about a few elements of that period. First, UNESCO. In the post-war World War II environment, UNESCO was formed as part of the United Nations and immediately presented a sharp focus on the work that museums could do in developing countries, in restoring communities and societies, repairing damage to cultural property, and to assist in the preservation of cultural materials in those areas that have been damaged by the war. The United States set up a commission under the State Department to work with UNESCO, and there were a series of studies and pronouncements made at that time. UNESCO began to survey museums worldwide and took steps to improve access to the collections of museums. One of the great issues was to provide access to the collections of museums to whoever needed access to them. And it emphasized as well training needs and the establishment of national committees. This is something of the backdrop coming out of World War II for the 1950s and 60s at the Smithsonian. And in 1965, the UNESCO affiliate of International Council of Museums, which had been set up right after the war along with UNESCO, met in New York City. This was its first triennial meeting outside of Europe. And it met at the Metropolitan and a number of the New York City museums, but it also, the delegates came to Washington on the occasion of James Smithson's 200th anniversary or birth, of his birth, at the Smithsonian. This was a full-fledged academic procession, lectures, symposia, scholars from around the world talking about the importance of the Smithsonian, but at the same time inviting in delegates internationally from the International Council of Museums who came down from New York and were addressed by President Lyndon Johnson at the time. And the president at that point stressed the importance of the work of museums in producing programs for society. I want to talk briefly about the Smithsonian. UNESCO. Let me just say this: the UNESCO urged that museums could serve as the intellectual and cultural centers in their own localities and contribute to the life of the community, and stressed the idea of engagement of museums in their communities. And I think that's one of the themes that was established in the 1960s internationally, but was also very much a factor in the American communities at the time, as museums in those communities sought recognition for federal funding. So at the Smithsonian in the 50s, as Pam has mentioned, there was a pent-up need in the 1950s for Smithsonian buildings. They needed new buildings. They had many of the projects that had been argued for over the years by the Smithsonian to expand its facilities by adding a Museum of History and Technology, an Air Museum, a National Collection of Fine Arts building. All of these have been deferred and were again deferred during the Korean War. Secretary Wetmore, as he retired in 1952, almost poignantly said, it's the obligation of a secretary. We would not be faithful to our trust if even during such periods of national emergency we relaxed our efforts to assure adequate support through public funds for safeguarding and preserving for future generations the treasures entrusted them by the American people. And you had the sense, as Wetmore left after 27 years at the Smithsonian, that he'd been trying to provide the kinds of resources that the Smithsonian needed, but been delayed. However, he did begin the exhibit modernization program right toward the end of his career, and Leonard Carmichael came in and moved it forward, and was also successful in getting the funding in the 50s and 60s, and moving into 1960, 61, 62 for the major building program that had been so long delayed. I say this because I think at a point these were the first priorities of the Smithsonian during that era. Carmichael pointed to the exhibit modernization as he left, and he also stressed the importance of the modernization program, claiming that the new exhibits would motivate the many millions of high school visitors attending each year. As you read the Smithsonian annual reports, you get this feeling that there's burgeoning numbers of people coming to the Smithsonian. Each year the numbers are going up and up, and this, of course, is the baby boomers. It's the post-World War II generations, and they were pressing museums in every community in the country, and the museum leaders in those communities were responding. There was more leisure time. There was emphasis on using all the resources in the community to educate this enormously new and demanding generation, and the Smithsonian was very much a part of it. So Carmichael could point at, as he completed his term, to the exhibit modernization program. I think there were some 28 new halls in the Smithsonian that had been completed during his tenure. The Museum of History and Technology was almost complete. There were extensions underway for the Natural History Building, and there were authorizations to construct the National Air Museum and to use the Patent Office for the National Collection of Fine Arts and the newly established National Portrait Gallery. So if that was an era of bricks and mortar in a sense, the 1960s would become one of education programs and professional practice. In the Kennedy administration stressed education. It injected spirit and public service into the national rhetoric, and I think that, and there was also a generation of people coming forward that was receptive to that. The Johnson administration brought in the Great Society. At the same time, Dillon Ripley came to the Smithsonian in right at the end of 1963, beginning of 1964, as the Museum of History and Technology opened, and he brought with him a new team of people. He added executives for general counsel, international activities, education and training, academic programs, elementary and secondary education, and museum programs. The last executive, by the end of the 60s, Paul Perot came and started the Office of Museum Programs and really expanded it. He was a proven museum professional, an international person in this focus, and he also was charged with implementing the National Museum Act, which I'll talk about in a minute. It was also an era when the Smithsonian Magazine began, the Smithsonian Associates, the American Folklife Festivals, Performing Arts. The programmatic and public arm of the Smithsonian really exploded during that era. And again, it was in response, I think, in part to the public demands. This team that Ripley brought in also began to work with the Office of Education. I want to look at the issues that faced the American Association of Museums and how it and the Smithsonian then worked during the 1960s. In 1962-63, the Smithsonian and the AAM together were surveying museums in the country. Nobody knew what was out there. Nobody knew what these museums were doing. There was no up-to-date documentation of the work of museums, of their diversity, of their service to communities. And it was at a time when museums themselves thought that they were educational. Because they did not have classrooms and they did not have organized organized educational activities, they were denied the tax benefit that went to educational organizations. So they had a lesser status. They were not performing arts organizations. They were not charitable organizations in the tax sense. So at the beginning of the 60s, there was a real effort to get tax benefits so that you could have lower postal rates and all the benefits that went along with the status of being a 501c3 organization, which museums became by the end of the decade. In addition, there were these new federal programs, Great Society programs, that were not including museums and were not recognizing museums as potential beneficiaries. So the survey that was being done in 1962-63 of some 4,500 museums in the country were critical to making the arguments here in Washington needed to get recognition for benefits for educational organizations that were, for the first time, really being made available under the Great Society programs. So there was, in addition to producing the directory of museums, and we see the new versions of it every day here. There had been one previous one in 1958, jointly published with the AAM and the Smithsonian. I might point out that the AAM's offices were at the Barney Studio House up in Sheridan Circle, and the printing of all of the AAM's bulletins and everything it did was done down in a boiler room of the castle right here. So there was a very close relationship between the two, and in fact, a kind of dependency, a symbiosis in a way, between the AAM and the Smithsonian. I would say what the AAM brought to the party was its council, which represented the major museums around the country, its 6 regional centers, which reached out to voters in all parts of the country, and its opportunity to provide advocacy for federal programs, and its private status. The Smithsonian had the leverage within Washington. It could mediate between the private museums and the needs in different museum communities across the country, as it worked with AAM and federal bureaucrats and politicians and Congress. So these two organizations came together in the very early 60s. They were already working on the questionnaire, but their relationship became formalized as it became clear that federal recognition was going to be the critical priority of the decade. There was in 1965, AAM announced the AAM-Smithsonian joint or cooperative program, and this was announced as not just SI and AAM, but also the Office of Education, and at one point also the cooperative program also included National Science Foundation. So depending on which of the museum news points of view topics was being addressed, there were different partners to this alliance. I mean, some of this was kind of deliberately hyped by, I would say, by the AAM, but it was a critical part of getting attention and rallying the membership and showing that there was potential in Washington. So the emphases in this early period were to establish a data bank here in Washington of museum information that would be maintained on the Smithsonian computers. They really didn't use the word data bank. There's a funny phrase that they used. They were just discovering the terminology for databases. Data bank was what they used. Database is what we would say today. But so these issues of providing information, developing training programs, accelerating publishing programs, all of these were features of this AAM Smithsonian cooperative program. In 1965, the Arts and Humanities Foundations were established, and the AAM and others working with it, including the Smithsonian, were instrumental in getting the word museum written in. There was a real pressure to keep museums out. Academics wanted humanities to be for the academics, and the arts people, the performing arts people, wanted to keep the pie for the performing arts. And museums had to get their way in there, and they had to prove they were valuable. So in this same period of time started the discussions for accreditation. What were museums? What were they not? Who was in and who was out? Museums were not really well known, and they needed to be able to define themselves and to show that they had standards similar to other professions. Libraries were already in and better recognized, but museums were not. So in 1962 began the first discussions of accreditation. And the National Trust was a key partner in that discussion because the Trust had developed standards for its historic houses. And they had gone through an accrediting process in the very beginning of the 60s and began to write articles, and the AAM would refer to the articles and the work of the Trust as an example of a sister organization that had begun to attack this issue. It took about 8 years for the issues of accrediting to be worked out. But it began very early, and it began as an attempt to gain the tax preferences that museums sought, and to be able to say what a museum was that deserved those preferences, as well as to begin to get support from federal government for and from state governments for the kinds of training and other benefits that they sought. Now, I talked briefly about the accreditation. Now let me talk about the relationship between Smithsonian Office of Education and AAM. In 1964, the Smithsonian set up meetings with the head of the Office of Education and brought in there were a number of key museum leaders that came together to talk about museum education, what it was, what museums offered, what services were being provided, for what ages, how they were being provided, and then to begin to talk about what their needs were. One of the members of this new team that Ripley had put together, Charles Blitzer, head of the Education and Training Division of the Smithsonian, received a grant from the Office of Education for a conference at the University of Vermont in 1965, which was really the first coming together of museums to look at the issues of education, and meeting with the Office of the Arts and Humanities branch of the Office of Education, the Dean of Ted Sizer, the Dean of the Graduate School at Harvard University. People were there like Otto Whitman, from the director of the Toledo Museum of Art, a cross-section of people from the museum field, from academe who were interested in education and the role that museums could play, and the federal government. By the end of 1965, museums were finally eligible to receive direct support from the Office of Education. The first Office of Elementary and Secondary Education Act in 1965 did not include museums as direct recipients, and they appealed, and by March of '66, they were able to get direct support for education programs. There were also a parallel development to receiving recognition as offering services to schools and to school groups, was the development of training and professional development programs for museums, which came in the form of the National Museum Act in 1965. Again, this was advanced by the Smithsonian, supported by the American Association of Museums and its regional conferences, and finally passed, although it was not funded substantially until 1972-73, at which point it was receiving some $600,000, $700,000 a year, and providing support for the various AAM regional conferences and for special topical conferences that would study particular issues, as well as for training programs at the Smithsonian. And it was a precursor of the Institute of Museum Services, which came into being by the end of the 70s. I'm not sure exactly what that date is, but there was this was kind of the lead arm. You had the Arts and Humanities branch, and you had funding there for museums in both sides. But here was a direct Smithsonian initiative to get the kind of money needed to provide widespread training, to upgrade the quality of knowledge and technical skill in a profession, so that museums could become accredited and could meet the standards that were required by taxes. So again, that legislation was 1965. Now, what I think I better wrap up here briefly. I think the key thing that was happening was the kind of convergence in the 1960s of pent-up public demand for services for museums, leading to the opportunity for museums to say, we're here, we're under-recognized, we're ready to work, we are working, but we need to be at the table in Washington. And they got at the table because of the close working relationship between AAM and the Smithsonian, and through that they got the congressional recognition and the recognition of various agencies in Washington to begin to get the programs in place that led to ongoing museum education, workshops and training that led to the professional training museum studies programs, that led to the accreditation, which provided standards against which museums could measure their performance, that in turn led to broader public support from foundations and from state and local governments and national government, and in a way established the field that we have today. Now, the Smithsonian not only helped catalyze these things and mediate between the museum community and agencies and Congress here, Ripley used the bully pulpit. He was out there talking at different conferences, and he was talking internationally. And I would say as well that the Smithsonian in that era demonstrated through its own enlargement of its own public programs, through establishing new divisions, new offices, and encouraging the work of its employees, encouraging their involvement in museum work. They demonstrated what a museum could be in this new era, which it was. And it continues to be that. So in a way, I think this period was transformative, not just for the museum profession, but in a way I think it was transformative as well for the Smithsonian. And I don't think the Smithsonian has been the same since. When you read the annual reports of the 1950s and 60s, and you see there are museum activities, and there is training, and there is organization, but the Smithsonian in that era is really pretty dominated by the scientific side and the research side of the house. And I think coming out of the 60s and into the 70s, there was a much different balance. Not to say that research wasn't being done and that the scientific activities of the Smithsonian weren't expanding and that research activities weren't expanding, but certainly you had a museum presence and that was equal to what the public expected of museums throughout the country and what they also expected of the Smithsonian. So I think there was a transformation both within the field itself and the recognition of it, internationally and nationally, as well as transformation within the Smithsonian, which is still, which is kind of dictated, in a sense, where we find ourselves today. So I think that sums it up, and we can talk during the discussion. Thank you.
I feel as though I've had an autobiographical tour of my life this morning, seeing images from Pam's presentation of those kids in the halls of the Smithsonian in the 1950s. One of those could have been me, coming up with my school classes to visit Washington, and then listening to Doug talk about the atmosphere that I entered when I came to Washington in 1970, and I have to suggest to Pam that she slightly modify one of her slides, because when you talk about museums and education, in 1969, Phil Ritterbush and others began something called the Museum Education Roundtable that many of us know and love well, and that was one of my early employers here when I came to Washington. So I feel as though I've had a kind of quick trip through my history here this morning. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here as a fellow at this institution, a very appreciative one, and delighted to have my two colleagues join me this morning to offer a look at Smithsonian activities while I'm going to ratchet the conversation into the stratosphere this morning and walk away from the particular to talk about some of the trends that I see. As I've worked on revising a book written by my father in the 1970s, it's been startling to look at the trends that I see, and I think that it makes most sense this morning for me to talk about some of those broader trends rather than the specifics. But it's interesting, as I was listening to Pam and Doug, some of my comments absolutely intersect with the comments that I want to make this morning. So I want to thank the Smithsonian for being so kind to me, particularly two ladies in this audience, Anna Brooke and Amy Levin, who have made my life here a delight. I was that researcher that showed up at odd hours seeking assistance, and they were always helpful to me, and thank you very much. I want to step away from the particular this morning and actually talk about something I've called three circles, but perhaps they're actually spirals. And they do intersect, but I'm not going to allow myself to get into the intersections. I'm rather going to force myself to talk about each of these spirals independently, and in Q&A we can certainly talk about how that's only one way to look at them. And I tried to come up, I'm not very good with titles of things, and I tried to come up with clever titles for my three circles and gave up, because I think it's more important for you to understand where I'm going in this conversation. So I'm going to talk about three circles, and the first one I'm calling deconstructing exhibitions. And the second one is actually a double spiral. It's constructing and deconstructing community. And the third circle or spiral is constructing the future. And while the first two spirals focus on museums and our audiences, the last one will actually focus on those of us who work within museums in a particular way. This construct came from a fabulous book that I encountered last summer, written by a gentleman named Mark Sandberg, and the book is actually called Living Pictures, Missing Persons. And Sandberg has looked at the role of the personal in the museum experience, particularly focusing on 19th century wax museums, known as panopticon, and looking at how those institutions developed and spread, particularly through Scandinavia and Europe. And he talks especially about the influence of the wax museum as an opportunity to what he calls leave traces of humanity in the exhibition process, taking museum exhibition opportunities away from taxonomic displays to actually what he calls living contextualized scenes. And wax museums began as pretty grisly places where you went to see what I think we call today chambers of horrors, terrible murders, the victims gushing blood, all this kind of thing. And as that very popular 19th century experience exploded, they began to add to it historical tableau that stepped away from the grisly to the intellectually and educationally founded experience of seeing a historic event in some way. The audience really was seen as a voyeur of an experience. And Sandberg argues that, in fact, this process ended with the coming of the photograph, which actually allowed you to see real experiences, at least in two dimensions. But what struck me about this fascinating discussion of 19th century wax museums was that, in fact, perhaps we're coming back to that. Think about the museums that have been in the press of late, and two come to mind. And I'm looking at Selma because I know she's been there. The first is the Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois. And I suspect that the American Association of Museums meeting this spring in Chicago, there will be a freeway back and forth to Springfield with perhaps museum folks hitchhiking on their way down to see this new exhibit. I haven't seen it. Selma has, and hopefully she can add to my comments. But what struck me was, here was Sandberg talking about the wax museum as this incredible phenomenon in European capitals, particularly, and large cities, and have we come full circle? Or is it a spiral? Because the elements of the Lincoln Museum that are talked about in such interesting ways have to do with the figure of Lincoln being present in the exhibits, in tableaus, in his office with his kids, playing amongst the mess of his office. Actually, and I should give credit to Dan Spock's review of the museum in Curator in January of 2006. And if you haven't read that article, look for it. It's a terrific, serious look at that museum, and I've stolen very much from Dan's comments to basically get my thinking about this notion of this circle of museum experience and museum exhibitions being deconstructed. But I did, and I want to close my comments about Lincoln with a quote from Bob Rogers, the designer, that is included in Spock's article. We wanted to break out of the pattern and change the definition of museum. And of course, as one deep in research on this book revision, I went, wait a second, that's not a change, it's a circle. So it really helped me come back to thinking about what museums are and how they work. And then I had the opportunity to go to Mount Vernon recently to see the new education center, which once again does what Sandberg talks about. It brings the traces of humanity into the museum experience. And the Mount Vernon conceit is that we don't have images of George Washington as a young man. We think of him as that figure on the dollar bill. So as you enter the education center, there's a lab, a kind of CSI type lab, showing you how they constructed Washington's, I think the word is physiognomy, from the work of forensic pathologists, literally looking at what were his facial structures like in his death mask and how do you go back from there. Once again, it's Sandberg's notion that it's that wax museum figure and the idea that it's allowing you to interact with the museum exhibition on a very personal level. Washington is there in I think there are 4 tableaux, beginning with him as a colonel in the Virginia militia. There are these 4 tableaus, and you see him age, and you watch his head and character. Obviously, he doesn't get shorter, but he changes as he grows. So that's my first circle, this deconstructing of the exhibition. The case is really gone, and I was looking at these wonderful cases and wondering where they come from. The second circle or spiral, and this one's a little complicated, has to do with the notion of community. And I was struck by Pam's talk about James Brown Goode and schools. Because the community origins that I see, the beginning of the circle or a spot in the circle that is so important to us, is the work of John Cotton Dana at the Newark Museum. And it's wonderful that his writings, which were written in the teens, are now republished in the 1990s so that they're so accessible to you. So you can really flip through quite easily and look at what he is thinking about. And it's so interesting and echoes a project of the American Association of Museums, that of the civic engagement effort of 5 years ago, where they really went out to look at museums as community. But the beginning of that arc or circle for me is John Cotton Dana and his incredible work at the Newark Museum, looking at the role of museums as community institutions. And I love it. He has 17 guidelines for museums represented at the 1916 AAM meeting. And one of his guidelines, number 14, is that all museums should have departments of cooperation, which I think is such a wonderful notion. And the cooperating partners that he identifies are, of course, his librarians, but it's also, as Good argues, it's also the school systems. It's not that the Newark Museum needs to become a school, it's that the Newark Museum needs to work with the members of the public education community to ensure that community service goes in many directions. So it struck me that, once again, it's this circle of the early teens in this country and the notion of community and bringing the audience into the museum, bringing artisans and their work into the museum. And the idea of the AAM a few years ago of looking at civic engagement and the argument that AAM made in their various publications that museums have an opportunity to become communities' front porches. I think that's a wonderful notion of a place where conversation happens, where arguments arise, where people interact on that front porch. And it seems to me, once again, it's a circle. It's not a progression. But the other piece of community which makes this spiral perhaps a double helix is the notion of the community edifice, which is the museum as a building within a town or city. And Mike Frisch has written so interestingly about the role of museums as ways for communities to make their presence known, to celebrate their contributions to the, particularly in this country, to the development of the United States as a powerful capitalist country. And I was struck as I thought about the notion of community and actually the edifices that reflect our communities, that there's been a slight twist, the double helix again, a slight twist to the notion of museums as these community institutions with the creation of places like, locally, the Torpedo Factory in Alexandria, which was a World War I torpedo factory that through a bicentennial project, actually became a very important art center for the city of Alexandria. The rehabilitation of the Inner Harbor in Baltimore focused on the National Aquarium as one of its major entities. The city of North Adams, Massachusetts, is now the home of Mass MoCA, which some might argue has made that city actually into a museum itself. And the last one that I've just uncovered and am learning a lot about is the Fiat plant in Turin, Italy. When the Olympics came, the city fathers took this space and said, oh my God, we've got all this square footage under roof. How can we make it help us with our Olympic bid? And it's become an art center, a museum, and a hotel, and a resource for the city of Turin. And I've heard, I don't know enough about this yet, but I've also learned that as part of that process, it was actually used as a way to keep the Fiat workers at work at a different kind of day job from making cars. So that second circle is a complicated one with both the sense of community in it and also the reflections of that sense of community in actual buildings. The final circle that I want to talk about has less to do with museum audience and museum representation, and perhaps more to do with what we in this room as museum, I love the term museum workers, are concerned about. In the course of my research, I've spent a lot of time reading about the creation of the outdoor history museums in Scandinavia and the role of the museum in protecting the traditional elements of the past. And there's a wonderful discussion in Mr. Sandberg's book about the notion of Skansen in Stockholm as allowing people to go to home. And it's not just folks who live in Sweden, it's folks who've come to Minnesota and now are going back to Sweden and going to Wisconsin to actually revisit elements of grandmother's life that they only heard about. And it's this notion that a museum is a place that protects things that perhaps are threatened. And of course, Arthur Hazelius and Anders Sandvig in Norway and Bernard Olsen in Denmark all sought to protect the peasant and rural life cultures from industrialization. So they were really like this. We don't like what we see. We're trying to protect the world from these new and threatening trends. In this country, one could put Henry Ford and Greenfield Village on that list, and the Rockefeller Project at Colonial Williamsburg as well, both of those beginning in the 1920s. But what does this have to do with museum practice in the 21st century? What's the threat that we face today? What is she talking about? In this instance, it's much less direct than John Cotton Dana and his community emphasis and AAM's subsequent project. It's more that Hazelius et al. Protected peasant and agricultural culture. And as I listen to museum workers these days, I hear a lot of conversation about the internet, the web, the threat of cyberspace. And it strikes me that it's a different kind of circle in this instance, that the threat is, as it was to Hazelius and that gang, industrialization, this threat is more an information revolution, opportunities for people to learn things not in the halls of our institutions but elsewhere. What does this do to our visitors? How does it affect what they expect when they come to us? Just as Hazelius was trying to provide Swedes with the culture that was threatened, what are we as museum workers charged with doing as our audiences, I might use the word splinter, in ways that we've not experienced before? And I want to suggest two things, and I'm not a techno guy at all, so I'm very much on thin ice here, but I think it's interesting to think about what the lessons are for us from our predecessors. And there seem to be two things that I think we need to pay attention to. One is, and has been said by Bob Sullivan at the Museum of Natural History, and that is that we can't think of ourselves only as a destination anymore. We have to think of ourselves as a part of a network, that we're only one stop in a process, and that the folks who actually now come to us are different from the folks who came from my classmates and me when we came to the Smithsonian in the 1950s. They have much more information. And Pam and I had a conversation as we were preparing for these remarks about the fact that there's all this information on the internet, but what is its value and what's real and what's a bunch of hooey? So I think we've got a real challenge as museum practitioners to serve the public that perhaps are becoming quite different than the public we're used to, because they may have they have access, we know, to much more information. That information is unmediated information, so it may be a bunch of hooey, but it's information that we need to be prepared to deal with as we prepare not only exhibitions but programs, as we think about how we interact with our visitors through the web. What can we do at their desktop to actually help them have perhaps a more complete experience in the museum setting. And I'm fascinated by Mr. Sandberg's notion of these traces of humanity. Where do they end up in our programming and in our exhibition development? I'm not good at ending things and tying them in a bow, and I was thinking about that this morning and thinking, what's the point of all of this morning? And I think my point is that we have so much to learn from folks who've gone before us, and there's so many lessons out there, and I think sometimes in our busy lives of doing new programs and mounting new exhibitions and having arguments about the messages of our collections, we forget that there are these folks whose shoulders we stand on, and it's of great value to look back and discover those shoulders. So I took the liberty of actually putting together for you what I am going to call a quirky reading list. This is not a comprehensive bibliography. I wouldn't let Nancy put it out before you came, because I was terrified that you would pick it up and go, oh, I have to go and read. These are 5 books that I've enjoyed over the last 2 years that I think, and one of them even longer, because Estill and Ripley's Sacred Grove is on this list. Because if you haven't read it lately, it's worth a return to it. This man was pretty incredible as the leader of this institution, and I think we sometimes forget that he was very, very thoughtful about the work we do at the Smithsonian. So I will, as I say, this is not a comprehensive bibliography. It's Mary's quirky reading list that I guarantee you will find these books thought-provoking and helpful. Thank you.
Are there questions and comments from the audience? Yes, Franklin.
Not a lot. It was a time of growing audience because the city was so busy, but extremely reduced funding. A lot of the staff was away at the war. So exhibits really stay quite static during that time period. And there isn't really a lot of public programming that's going on as well. So it really is a time of stasis. It's a time of great growth in the collections. Once the occupation of the Pacific begins, the Smithsonian sees this as a tremendous opportunity to collect Pacific natural history and cultural materials, and we become a center really for Pacific collections during World War II. But that's its major effect. We're not really doing much innovative in the museum field as far as I have seen.
Thank you, Pam. That was a good question, Franklin. Are there no other comments? Franklin, if you repeat the question, because he won't be.
The impact of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s?
Now, let me pick up on Pam's answer. The Smithsonian got involved in tracking satellites. It was very important. There was an International Geophysical Year, and Pam can elaborate on this, declared in the kind of, I think it was in the early 50s, and it was a way in which international organizations and bodies could come together to talk about key issues affecting the world, primarily scientific and geopolitical issues. And this was one of there were about 15 or 18 different areas of study, and this was a group that came together and made these pronouncements, and that one of them was tracking satellites. And the Smithsonian was able to get some funding, I think, and it had astrophysical observatories. So when Sputnik went up, where were these satellites? What were they doing? And when could you predict when you would see one? All of these issues. So the Smithsonian got involved in that. Obviously, it had a strategic ramification. Also, science education, science in the schools, and this exhibit modernization. Secretary Carmichael, basically said this is going to help the many millions of high school visitors attending the Smithsonian, that this will help assure that the country is going to remain scientifically and technologically strong. So I think there are emphases both in the research side of the Smithsonian and its parts, as well as in the public education side, that reflected Cold War attitudes, even though the Cold War meant that the Smithsonian was not getting a lot of money for this.
Thank you. Yes.
places where people can learn and be evaluated on what they learn, and that the museum evaluation is focusing very much on what people learn in museums. And I think he's positing that maybe we work ourselves kind of into a corner of creating a situation where we look at museums as in a way kind of a substitute for the classroom, so this is maybe another circle. And I know at the Smithsonian there's a lot of emphasis on working with teachers on, in a way, kind of duplicating what teachers do in terms of creating curriculum packets and justifying what we do in terms of school standards. So I'm just wondering whether you have any thoughts on the direction that Smithsonian education is going in terms of its very, very strong emphasis on the link with formal education and where informal education, as we used to call it, stands at the Smithsonian today.
Well,
Who would like to handle that?
I can answer at least part of it, is that our partnership with the school systems right now is driven by a very strong emphasis at a lot of state levels, standards of learning, that students must learn to deal with primary sources. And this has created a tremendous need and hunger in the educational community because these teachers really were not educated in primary sources themselves. And we're really playing a very central role in terms of educating the teachers to respond to these standards of learning. And I think this is going to be happening for some time in the future. I don't see us as duplicating in any way, but I think that there is now a need for teachers to be competent with the use of documents, the use of images, the use of objects in the classroom, and we really know the methodologies for teaching these teachers and getting them comfortable, and then also provide the resources for them to use either through programming here or things on the internet. So I see that, in my view, as teaching has evolved and as primary sources have become really important in the 21st century classroom, we have this key role to play in helping those teachers meet those needs.
I'd like to get away from the Smithsonian for a moment and really talk more from my professional experience at the moment in Maryland. We've just done a study of hours of social studies instruction in Maryland's 24 counties, and it is on the decline because of the impact of No Child Left Behind and the requirements of that test. And the history museums that I work with across the state are trying to look, actually, Gretchen, at non-classroom activities that will attract children and their families to the museums, because teachers can't take the time to leave the classroom to come to a museum experience unless the museum experience is focused on curriculum. So there's a kind of trap that, just as you suggest, there's a trap there that you go down that road, and then as curriculum ebbs and flows, you've got to be agile enough to respond to those needs. And what's interesting is I think what gets lost in this, and I haven't read that particular Spock article, what gets lost in this, I think, is the notion of museums not so much as educational experiences, but as places for reflection and more casual educational opportunities rather than what one might call instruction, and where that fits in the whole complex of this challenge that I talked about in my last circle, because we're getting people coming into museums now who've seen a bunch of stuff on the internet about X, and now they want to see the real thing, and so the whole educative process is being transformed a bit.
I'd like to add one more thing. It picks up on your comment about the uses of the internet, and also reflects the comments that UNESCO made in the 1940s and 50s about the role of museums, making the collections accessible. I think one of the jobs we have is to translate the importance of the artifacts and objects and collections that we have by taking selected examples and using the knowledge that our scholars have and our educators have to put those objects and collections into some kind of context that can be made accessible through internet, so that teachers can use them, so that families can use them, so that parents can become better teachers themselves. In other words, we have resources. We have resources not only in the collections themselves, but in what we know about their context and their importance. If they're important enough for us to collect them and to study them, they're important enough for us to tell somebody else how to use them and to suggest ways to use them. Schools don't have that capacity. We do. And we now have technology that can move information around and also open up through search devices that empower people in distant places to get access to what we know. So I think there's a real challenge here for museums to work with what they already have. We are different from schools, and the school teachers are increasingly pressured. And what we see is museums who are trying to say, okay, now how does what we are going to do fit that curriculum or that standard or this standard so that we can help them? And that's important to do. We need to continue to serve in that way. But I think we also, as we organize information about our collections and as we set our priorities for what we're going to do with the time it takes to put something up on the internet, we ought to think of some packaging that makes our resources a better tool for students, for families, for teachers, for others.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was a challenging question. Stephanie? Sure, Doug.
Not on this topic, but I just want to say that I think the Smithsonian resources in the libraries, I want to thank Amy Levin for her help, but also I think there's a lot of good work that could be done by graduate students and others, looking at the origins of the Office of Museum Programs, for example, and the types of activities that it was promoting, and in connection with other museum organizations as well in the late 60s and early 70s. The kind of initiatives that got started at that time, and they were not done just by the Smithsonian, they were done with other organizations and with other people. It was a catalytic activity by the Smithsonian, and it was at a time of the emergence of stronger organizations, the Association of Science and Technology Centers, and AASLH, and State and Local History, and a number of other organizations were themselves professionalizing, and the field itself was becoming more and more specialized. And under AAM, there were all of these new specialized organizations shaping. And in the middle of that, you had an office at the Smithsonian that was really set up to provide services and to bring these people together and study issues of how people reacted to exhibits. I think there probably are 2 or 3 theses in the records of the Smithsonian, and I would invite people to use them.
Thank you. Mangela?
You mentioned the change that the Olympic world, you mentioned internationalism. He talked a lot about opening doors for communities, which is a circle that Miriam mentioned, the Brookhaven community. And then Bob Adams, I think he was on your historical list. Bob Adams coined new phrases for cultural diversity, cultural equity, and in this time that we got federally funded heritage and celebrations, he used to himself go to the events and he made sure across the institution that there was sensitivity to these issues. I just wonder where the institutions stand today, especially in comparison to museums across the country.
Where it stands today?
In this area.
Why don't you take it?
Summarizing the question is that what we saw through the Estill and Ripley and Robert McCormick Adams eras at the Smithsonian was an increasing focus on internationalism and developing those type of relationships in our work. And where are we heading in the 21st century in terms of that type of internationalism? Is that a internationalism, but right, yeah, even focusing on culture, absolutely, yeah. Yes, yes.
Well, let me take a shot at that. I think certainly the Folklife Festival continues to be a very strong central Smithsonian program that draws on many of the offices and resources of the Smithsonian and takes a global approach. And I know I was just emailing somebody in Queensland. There's a program in Queensland, Australia, joint program with the Smithsonian. And I emailed somebody over there, and they sent me back a kind of an update on what's been happening. Richard Curran's been over there, and Richard West has been over there, and they're talking about issues of dealing with indigenous cultures and the settings that they have there. I think that the work continues at the Smithsonian, but I think it's more dispersed. I think there's more of a spine between what the Folklife Festival was doing in the 80s and 90s and what it's doing today, more of a straight line. I think in other organizations, I'm sure that in natural history and some of the other, and STRI and some of the other research entities that have been out in global areas, that there are relationships that are as strong now as they ever have been with international groups that those disciplines deal with. I think NMAI is an example of a museum that doesn't call itself a museum. It calls itself an International Institution of Living Cultures with an S. Recognizing that it is hemispheric in its scope, that it works with contemporary people today and working with them to help them reach larger audiences and also develop that programs that sustain their cultures and vitalize their cultures. So there's a museum that specifically is in that business. I don't know what African art does, but my guess is that there are many different activities occurring within the museums themselves. I don't see it coordinated centrally and enunciated centrally as it once was. That could be a change in the times. It could be a change in the environment. The post-war period was one of putting the world back together again, and the importance of exchanges of people and exchanges of collections was the highest priority in many ways, because it was the only way you could be exposed to other cultures and begin to start communicating again, come back together again. So in the post-war period, and I think this carried into the 60s, there was a great, the Fulbright program came out of that. And one of the steps was, how can we get museum people in the Fulbright program? So the museum people go. The Scandinavian, you mentioned Scandinavian museums? AAM and the Smithsonian State Department set up exchanges of museum professionals in the early, late 50s, 1960s, and 30 or 40 museum professionals would come through the State Department from all over the world. They would come here, and they would tour museums around the country, and then they would wind up at wherever AAM's meeting was, and then they would be there. I don't know where that program went, but it was formalized well into the 60s. A lot of things were affected, particularly relations with the Soviet Union. There was a lot of activity in the Smithsonian in the 60s of having exchanges of museum professionals between the two, and everything was signed and ready to go, and it was nixed in 1966 because of Vietnam. And it didn't pick up again until the 70s. China, Nixon went to China. Immediately, museum people were going to China. So I'm digressing a bit here, but I think within the Smithsonian, I think the initiatives now are taken locally, and I think that's we're in a different era now.
Thank you very much. Is there one more comment, question? Yes.
Well, again, I can't speak for the Smithsonian, but I think a lot of the work is done by people who are lead conservators and are working through the international groups that conservators work through. And there are organizations like COMOS. There are different international entities that Smithsonian staff belong to. There doesn't seem to me to be a particular office at the top of the Smithsonian charged with those kinds of international issues. It's now in the Ripley period there was an Office of International Activities, but again it was a rebuilding period. It was the United States was trying to relate to UNESCO and to other entities around the world and build back or build for the first time platforms for working. I think, I don't know, you might have a better perspective of where, if there were to be an international museum initiative. I think the United States is now recognizing UNESCO again. There's more closer relationship, but the Institute of Library and Museum Services is the one that I think has the lead office. And in a way, museum representation, AAM is much stronger now than it ever was. So a lot of these international issues that relate to museums might first go to AAM. There are a number of Smithsonian staff members who are on the board of the International Council of Museums. I'm no longer on it, but I think Rick West still is, and there have been a number of, Elaine Johnston in the General Counsel's office was a member, Nancy's been active on it. So I think there are many ways in which individuals are encouraged to play a role. I was by my directors, and I think others around the Smithsonian. So I think that's how it works now. And we're in a pretty tough time. There's a lot that we want to do and can do, and I think we shouldn't dampen our ardor for getting involved and serving, but we have many avenues in which we can work through the international organizations that are now in place and that we are members of that simply weren't there 25 years ago.
Thank you so very much. You've been a really nice audience, and I think they've been terrific presenters. Should we give them one more hand? I'm sure if you have some questions or comments you'd like to talk with further, they'll be available. And please help yourself to juice and cookies or bagels or whatever back there. See, we seem to have a lot of them.